Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight, we set sail to the Kraken, myths, history, and the deep. The sea was calm that night, stretched out under a pale moon like a sheet of beaten silver. The merchant ship, vigilant, moved steadily through the waters off the coast of Norway, her sails breathing softly in the steady wind. The air carried a scent of salt and kelp, and somewhere far below, the unseen currents moved with their own quiet purpose.
On deck, the crew spoke in hushed tones. Not because they feared waking anyone, most of the men were already half asleep at their posts, but because the sea itself seemed to demand it. There was something in its stillness, something that made voices naturally soften, as though the ocean was listening.
Eric Jansen, the ship's first mate, leaned on the railing and peered into the dark water. He had sailed these routes for nearly 20 years, but tonight the surface seemed different. It wasn't the color — moonlight always played tricks with the shade of the sea — but rather the way it moved. There was no swell, no rhythm of waves, only a slow, almost imperceptible roll, like the breathing of some great animal beneath.
A faint splash drew his attention. Not far from the bow, a cluster of seabirds circled low, calling sharply, then darting away. They did not land. That was unusual. In calm seas like this, birds would often rest on the water. Tonight, they avoided it entirely. Behind him, a quiet voice spoke.
"You're looking for a two, aren't you?"
It was old Lars, the ship's cook, his weathered face half in shadow beneath a woolen cap. He was leaning against a coil of rope, a clay pipe in one hand. Eric raised an eyebrow. "Looking for what?" Lars took a slow draw on the pipe before answering. "The thing they called the Kraken." The name hung in the air for a moment, carried off in a curl of smoke. Eric almost smiled. Almost. But there was something in Lars's tone that kept the humor from reaching his lips. The Kraken. Every sailor who worked the northern seas had heard the tales. A beast of impossible size, said to rise from the depths and drag whole ships under. Some swore it had tentacles as long as a mast was tall, covered with suckers big enough to swallow a man's head. Others claimed it was not a single creature at all, but an island of living flesh, mistaken for rock until it moved. Eric had heard the stories since he was a boy. They had the same quality as ghost tales, meant to pass the time on long voyages, to keep green sailors wide-eyed at night. But Lars was not the type to repeat old fictions for sport. The old man exhaled, the ember in his pipe flaring briefly. "These waters we're crossing now," Lars continued, "are where the sagas say it waits. The Norsemen called it the Hafgufa, the sea mist, the ocean ghost. They said it could open its mouth so wide that fish would swim in by the thousands, thinking it a cavern. And when enough had gathered, the beast would close its jaws and sink again." Eric said nothing. The wooden hull creaked softly underfoot. In the quiet, the past seemed closer. It was not hard to imagine a longship gliding over these same waters 1,000 years ago, its crew staring into the deep and whispering prayers to Thor or Odin. In those days, the ocean's uncharted depths were filled with monsters. And perhaps Perhaps they still were. A bell rang once from the stern, the change of the watch. Men shuffled sleepily across the deck, their boots thudding softly on the planks. Above, the sails swelled, catching a fresh breeze. The ship moved forward, the bow splitting the water with a whisper. But the calm did not lift. The sky was clear, the stars sharp against the blackness, and yet the sea still moved with that strange, slow pulse. Eric stayed at the rail long after Lars had gone below. Far out in the distance, the moonlight caught something, a shadow just beneath the surface. For a heartbeat, it seemed vast, impossibly vast, and then it was gone. By morning, the weather had changed. A soft fog had risen, wrapping the ship in a pale, glowing shroud. The crew worked in near silence, their voices muffled by the mist. From somewhere far below came the faint sound of water bubbling, as though great streams of air were rising from the depths. Eric leaned over the side, peering into the milky water. He saw nothing at first, only his own reflection, blurred by the ripples. Then slowly, something darker began to take shape far beneath the surface. It was not solid, not exactly. More like a shifting mass, as if the ocean itself was gathering into form. A voice in his memory whispered, "The Kraken sleeps until it rises." The ship sailed on. The shadow remained for a long time, drifting just out of sight, as though following.
The fog clung to the vigilant like a living thing, coiling around the rigging and draping the masts in pale veils. It was the kind of fog that seemed to swallow sound, where even the creak of the timbers and the flap of the sails felt muffled, as though the air itself had grown thick. In the dim light of the early morning, Eric found himself standing beside Captain Torvald, a tall man with a frame like an oak trunk and a beard silvered by years at sea. Torvald was not prone to superstition. He was a man of charts and compasses, of tide tables and trade routes, and yet even he kept glancing into the mist, as though expecting it to part and reveal something vast and terrible. "These waters," Torvald murmured, his voice low, "were sailed by my grandfather's grandfather. He told of places where the sea would breathe like a beast, said the waves would pull in strange ways, as if the ocean had a heartbeat." Eric thought of the slow, rolling pulse he had felt beneath the ship the night before. It had not been the ordinary rise and fall of swells. It had been something deeper, slower, as though the sea itself inhaled and exhaled. The captain's words stirred memories of old stories Eric had heard as a boy, stories told by the hearth in the long, dark winters of the north. In those tales, the Havgufa, the sea mist, was not merely a creature, but an ancient force, older than men, older than the gods. Some sagas said it was the spawn of Jormungandr, the world serpent who encircled the earth in Norse myth. Others claimed it was the remnant of a giant slain by Odin, its body sunk into the deep, and yet still alive in some fashion, dreaming beneath leagues of black water. In the oldest manuscripts, brittle with age, written in runes that curled like the tails of waves, there were drawings. They did not show a squid or an octopus as we know them today, but a shape so vast it dwarfed the ships beside it, a mass of tentacles spread like roots into the deep, a central maw dark as night, gaping open to swallow whole schools of fish, and around it an aura of death, not because it hunted sailors deliberately, but because the sea itself churned to chaos when it rose.
Torvald spoke again, as if sensing Eric's thoughts. When the Norse sailed west to Iceland and Greenland, some ships never returned. No wreckage, no bodies, just gone. The sagas say the Hafgufa was to blame. He turned, fixing Eric with a look both steady and strange. And those who claimed to see it said the water boiled before it appeared. The words settled heavily between them. Below decks, the crew muttered their own versions of the myth. Some spoke of sailors who mistook the Kraken's back for an island, only to have it sink beneath them. Others told of whirlpools that spun without warning, pulling ships down into cold, silent graves. And still others swore that the Kraken could call storms, not with magic, but by sheer movement, displacing enough water to change the weather itself. The cook, old Lars, told one of the quieter legends that the Kraken was not evil, not truly. It was simply a part of the sea's design, like a storm or a tide. To fear it was like fearing the moon's pull on the water. But to ignore it, that was foolishness. The fog thickened as the day went on, the horizon vanishing entirely. At midday, the lookout reported something unusual. A cluster of fish leaping in panic near the starboard side. No predator broke the surface, but the water below them churned in a strange, spiraling motion, as if something immense moved far beneath. Eric leaned out to watch. The fish scattered again, vanishing into the depths. For a moment, the water stilled. Then came the faintest tremor through the ship's hull, not a wave striking wood, but a slow, resonant shudder, as though the ocean floor itself had shifted. In that moment, Eric thought of the Norsemen crossing these same waters centuries before. Their longships were small compared to the Vigilant, yet they braved the same seas, with only the stars and their gods for guidance. In the sagas, it was said that the bravest warriors were those who could stand at the bow when the Hafgufa rose, not to fight it, but simply to look upon it without turning away. And somewhere deep inside, Eric wondered, if such a moment came for him, would he stand, or would he flee?
Long before charts marked every coastline and currents were plotted with the precision of science, there were stories whispered between sailors in the dim light of a galley lamp, or sung in low, mournful tones while mending nets under a gray sky. Among these tales were those of the Hafgufa, the sea mist, and of Lingbakker, the heatherback. The names varied between ports, but the descriptions were strangely alike. An island that was not an island, a shape that seemed part of the sea itself, until the waves began to move in unnatural ways. In the fjords of Norway, old men spoke of voyages cut short by an invisible hand beneath the water. The ocean would grow strangely still, and fish would vanish from the nets. The sky might be calm, but the sea would breathe differently, as if a massive creature, far below, was drawing in water through unseen lungs. And then, the boil. It was always described the same way,
bubbles rising in widening circles, as though something vast were stirring the seabed. Sometimes the water would darken, thick with a strange oily sheen. The bravest men swore they saw shapes beneath, coiling limbs thicker than a man's torso, moving with impossible grace. But these were not merely tales of fishermen who had drunk too much ale. The old sagas, preserved on brittle vellum in remote Icelandic monasteries, held verses that spoke of a monster whose size defied measure. It was said that a single arm of the beast could wrap around the mast of a warship and drag it under, without so much as a splash. In 1250, the Norwegian king's court scribe, Audur Snorrason, recorded in his Latin chronicle a warning passed down from sailors. Quote, "Beware the deep places where the sea boils without wind, for there sleeps the Hafgufa, whose jaws are a gateway to death." End quote. Some versions told that the creature would open its mouth and emit a strange scent, invisible in the air, but irresistible to fish. Entire shoals would swim willingly into its waiting maw, followed, in their hunger, by seals and seabirds, and by the ships that pursued them. It was not hunger alone that made the Kraken feared. It was its patience. Unlike the sharks or orcas, it did not chase. It waited. It listened. And when the moment came, it would rise with a speed that mocked its size.
In coastal villages from the Lofoten Islands to Bergen, children were taught never to trust an island that looked too perfect. If there were no birds resting upon it, if the rocks seemed damp, even on a clear day, it was not land. It was the back of something alive. The deeper history, hidden in yellowed shipping ledgers and scattered survivor accounts, suggested that the monster was not merely myth. Between 1532 and 1648, more than 24 vessels vanished in the waters between Iceland and Greenland. Most were never found. A few wrecks washed ashore, but they bore strange marks, shattered planks bent inward as though crushed by tremendous pressure, and thick slime clinging to the wood, unlike any seaweed or barnacle. Even the pragmatic Dutch merchants, men of maps and cargo tallies, began making quiet offerings before leaving port. A small fish, wrapped in linen, cast into the harbor as the tide turned. Not because they truly believed, they said, but because there was no harm in being careful. It was during one such voyage, in the year 1603, that the first widely recorded modern sighting took place. The Anna Christina, a merchant flui bound for Trondheim, was caught in the sudden calm. The crew watched as the sea around them began to churn, not with storm, but with rising bubbles the size of barrels. The ship's carpenter, Willem Johnson, would later write in his journal, "I saw the water swell, as though something beneath did press against it. Then came a shadow, vast and round, and many arms like the rigging of ships, moving in all directions. I know not how far it reached, for I dared not look longer." They escaped, barely. A sudden swell carried them forward, and when they looked back, the sea was smooth again. But the Anna Christina returned to port, missing 2 longboats, both torn from their davits as if plucked away by unseen hands. From that day, the whispers grew. The Kraken, once only a fireside story, became a caution in sailors' charts, marked not by name, but by small circles inked in red, with the simple note, "Avoid in calm." It was the beginning of the Kraken's transformation from shadow in saga to shadow in history,
And though the centuries would bring exploration, discovery, and reason, the great beast of the deep would remain just beyond proof, yet never beyond fear. By the mid-17th century, the oceans had become highways for empires. The sails of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, England, and France billowed over waters that for much of history had been left to fishermen and storm. But with ambition came peril, not just from enemy cannon, but from the deep itself. In this age, mapmakers in Amsterdam and Lisbon began to fill the blank corners of their charts. Sometimes they sketched the outlines of newly found islands, sometimes the silhouettes of beasts, creatures drawn in ink with coiling limbs and dark eyes that stared from beneath the waves. One such chart, printed in Antwerp in 1652 by cartographer Hendrik Donker, shows the coast of Iceland surrounded by curling tentacles. The accompanying note, written in a careful hand, warns, "In these waters swims the Kraken, whose reach is such that the greatest ship may be swallowed whole." Donker was not a man of superstition. His livelihood depended on accuracy. Yet, he left the Kraken on his map not as decoration, but as a warning from the captains whose words he trusted.
They cut their anchor rope and fled under full sail, leaving the anchor and half their catch behind. For weeks afterward, the crew avoided speaking of it in public, fearing they would be mocked. But among sailors, the story spread faster than the wind. The Danish-Norwegian bishop and scholar Erik Pontoppidan, who would later write one of the most famous accounts of the Kraken in 1752, gathered such stories from these decades. He noted that the Kraken was often linked with abundance, for wherever the beast appeared, the sea teemed with fish. This was perhaps the one kindness the monster offered to humankind. It brought life before it brought death. Pontoppidan described the Kraken not as a serpent or fish, but as something closer to a great cephalopod, perhaps the progenitor of all squids. He wrote that when it surfaced, it could be mistaken for land, and that its sheer size meant only a fraction of it was ever visible at one time. During these years, the Kraken began to take on a strange double life. To the scientific mind, it was an animal, perhaps rare, perhaps misunderstood. To the common sailor, it was a living force of the sea, an ancient will that rose and sank according to its own mysterious rhythm. Superstition held that the Kraken could not be killed, for it was as much a part of the ocean as the tides. A few legends even claimed that there were more than one, perhaps a breeding pair, roaming the North Atlantic in wide circles over centuries. And so the story spread, following the trade routes from Bergen to Boston, from the Shetlands to the Caribbean. In smoky taverns in Port Royal and New Amsterdam, men who had never seen a snow-covered fjord would speak in hushed tones about the northern Leviathan, as if it might swim into their own waters one day. By the end of the 17th century, the Kraken was no longer confined to the imagination of Norse sailors. It had become a part of the world's maritime vocabulary, feared, respected, and, in some strange way, accepted. But the next century would bring a new kind of witness, the age of the natural philosophers. These were men who would not be content with hearsay. They wanted specimens, measurements, proofs, and in pursuing them, they would push deeper into the Kraken's shadow than any had dared before.
The dawn of the 18th century brought with it a new breed of voyager, not merely explorers or merchants, but natural philosophers. These were men with brass instruments in velvet-lined cases, journals bound in calfskin, and the conviction that nature could be measured, catalogued, and understood. Where earlier sailors spoke of the Kraken with awe or dread, these men spoke of it with a certain hunger, the hunger to classify. They traveled alongside naval expeditions, merchant convoys, and whaling fleets, listening to the yarns spun in sailors' quarters, taking notes by candlelight, and, when possible, seeking first-hand observation. Among these men, the Danish-Norwegian bishop Erik Pontoppidan stands as one of the most influential voices. From 1738 to 1751, Pontoppidan gathered reports along the coasts of Norway and Iceland, interviewing shipmasters, fishermen, and even retired whalers in remote villages. In his two-volume Natural History of Norway, 1752 to 1753, he dedicated several chapters to the Kraken. His words struck a balance between caution and belief. He wrote, "It is said that when it rises to the surface, the appearance is such that the unwary might take it for a chain of small islands. The fish gather in great numbers about the monster, as if driven there by some unseen force." Pontoppidan's account fascinated the reading public. He did not dismiss the Kraken as myth. Instead, he considered it a rare but entirely possible creature, perhaps related to the giant squid. Yet he admitted that its sheer size, said to span a mile and more, challenged even the boldest natural philosophy.
Throughout the mid-18th century, reports from merchant captains and whaling crews continued to filter into European ports. Many described enormous tentacled carcasses washed ashore, too decomposed to be identified with certainty. Others told of strange beaks, large enough to crush a barrel, found in the bellies of sperm whales. These fragments fueled debate in the lecture halls of London, Paris, and Copenhagen. Some argued that such remains belonged to ordinary squid, exaggerated by frightened sailors. Others saw them as proof that the ocean still held monsters capable of swallowing a ship. In 1786, a whaling ship out of Greenland reported a battle between a pod of sperm whales and an immense cephalopod. The crew claimed to see great arms wrapping around one whale, pulling it partly under before the others rammed the creature until it retreated into the depths. Though no specimen was recovered, the story was passed from tavern to tavern until it reached the ears of scholars. By this time, the Kraken had become a creature balanced on a knife's edge between legend and science. The old sagas had woven it into a tapestry of sea spirits and giants. The new era tried to stitch it into the framework of natural history. Some naturalists proposed it was a Cephaloptera gigantica, a colossal cuttlefish. Others suspected a surviving branch of some prehistoric mollusk unknown to taxonomy. But for every rational hypothesis, there were still sailors' tales of whirlpools, shattered hulls, and vanished ships. What united them all, scientist and sailor alike, was the sense that the deep ocean was still a place of shadows. The 18th century had mapped coastlines, charted currents, and even measured the depths with weighted lines. But those lines could only sink so far, and what lay beneath remained unknowable. The Kraken, in this way, was more than just a creature. It became a symbol of the unseen world, the reminder that for all humankind's progress, the sea kept its own counsel. By the close of the century, the hunt for the Kraken was no longer just about proving or disproving a legend. It was about confronting the limits of knowledge and the humility of knowing that some things, perhaps, were meant to remain just out of reach.
The 19th century arrived with the hiss of steam and the smell of coal smoke. Iron ships now crossed the oceans alongside wooden ones, and telegraph cables began stitching distant ports into a network of instant messages. The seas had not changed, but the eyes that looked upon them had grown more determined. For centuries, the Kraken had lived in the hazy waters between fear and fascination, its image shaped by rumor and retelling. Now, in an age where photography was climbing from novelty into science, there arose a new ambition: to see the monster for oneself, and better still, to capture it. Marine naturalists equipped themselves with not just journals and measuring lines, but with the bulky, brass-bound cameras of the day. The exposure times were long, the plates delicate, and the chances of photographing something in the open ocean slim. Yet the idea took hold. One clear photograph could end centuries of debate. In the summer of 1853, newspapers from Halifax to London carried sensational reports of a massive carcass that had washed ashore near Bonavista, Newfoundland. Witnesses described arms thicker than a man's body and a beak like the jaws of a monstrous parrot. Local photographers attempted to capture images, but the glass plates were underexposed and blurred, a ghostly suggestion of coils and shadows rather than solid proof. Scientists who examined the remains concluded it was an unusually large squid, but not the mile-long kraken of lore. Still, the photographs, such as they were, circulated in illustrated papers, and each retelling seemed to add a little more size, a little more menace. Not all kraken sightings were honest. The public's hunger for spectacle was easy prey for clever showmen. In 1873, an American sideshow in Boston displayed what it claimed was the preserved head of a kraken. The object, a tangle of papier-mâché, whale cartilage, and dried octopus parts, drew crowds, until a curious journalist noted that the tentacles had seams and glue marks. The hoax was revealed, but the effect was the opposite of what skeptics hoped. Instead of killing belief, it inflamed it. People reasoned that if showmen were faking krakens, it must be because someone had seen a real one first.
If there was any single venture that brought the Kraken closer to the realm of science, it was the HMS Challenger expedition. A 4-year voyage that dredged the ocean floor, measured depths, and collected thousands of species unknown to science. While the Challenger never netted a kraken, it did recover large sections of giant squid, including beaks and tentacles up to 9 meters long. The scientists concluded that enormous cephalopods did indeed exist, perhaps not the mile-wide island beasts of myth, but still larger than any creature most had believed possible. In December 1896, 2 men walking the beach near St. Augustine, Florida, discovered a pale, rubbery mass half buried in sand. The local physician, Dr. DeWitt Webb, photographed it, one of the first clear images of a suspected giant squid carcass. The St. Augustine monster, as it was called, was measured at 6 meters across and estimated to weigh several tons. Though later studies suggested it was decomposed whale blubber, at the time it was hailed as proof that the Kraken, or something like it, was real. By the close of the 19th century, the Kraken had undergone a subtle transformation. The monstrous, mile-long destroyer of ships was giving way to the scientifically plausible giant squid. And yet, in sailors' taverns and in the minds of the public, the old Kraken still lurked, not as a specimen in a jar, but as the great shadow under the ship, the unseen thing that might rise from the abyss. The camera had not slain the legend. If anything, it had given it sharper teeth. The first half of the 20th century was an era when oceans became battlefields. Steel-hulled ships and submarines prowled beneath the waves, carrying death and secrecy in equal measure.
and in the fog of war, strange sightings often went unexplained or unreported for decades. During World War I, merchant vessels and naval warships crossed vast oceans under constant threat from German U-boats. Many of these encounters were purely mechanical: torpedoes, mines, and the cold arithmetic of tonnage lost. But sailors also whispered of stranger events. In the North Atlantic, the crew of the British cargo steamer HMS Britannia reported being stalked by a vast shape moving parallel to the ship just beneath the surface. It matched their speed for nearly 20 minutes before vanishing into the depths. Some claimed it was a German submarine. Others swore it moved like something alive. The incident never made official reports, possibly because wartime intelligence preferred not to clutter logs with tales of monsters. If any vessels were likely to encounter a Kraken, it would be submarines, the first true human intruders into the creature's cold, dark realm. A particularly persistent legend involves the German U-boat U-85, sunk off the coast of North Carolina in 1918. Divers exploring the wreck decades later claim to have found deep gouges in the hull too wide to have been made by human tools. Skeptics argued it was corrosion. Believers said the pattern looked eerily like sucker marks.
By the time of World War II, sonar was a vital tool for detecting submarines. The technology worked by sending sound pulses into the water and reading the echoes. But sonar operators sometimes saw things that didn't match any known vessel profile. A declassified 1943 British Navy log from a convoy escort in the North Atlantic describes an extremely large, slow-moving contact at depth, greater in length than a destroyer. When the contact was pursued, it descended rapidly, far faster than any submarine of the era. The report ends with the cryptic note, "Assume biological origin, no further action." In both wars, secrecy was paramount. Reports that could cause panic or feed enemy propaganda were buried under classification. This meant many strange encounters were logged only in personal journals or passed along as mess deck rumors. An American destroyer captain in the Pacific, interviewed late in life, recalled seeing what he believed to be an enormous squid attacking a drifting lifeboat. "We opened fire," he said, "but it sank before we could get close. The men in the boat, they were gone." Wartime also saw the Kraken myth repurposed. Propaganda leaflets in the Pacific depicted Allied ships being dragged under by enormous tentacles, the Kraken standing in for the enemy's unstoppable might. In Germany, a 1940 newspaper cartoon showed a giant squid labeled England trying to strangle Europe, while in America, it became the Axis power's symbol of creeping expansion. The myth had become so embedded in human imagination that it could be wielded like any other weapon, fear, without needing proof. The wars left the oceans littered with wrecks, unexploded ordnance, and the graves of thousands. In such places, myths thrived. Sailors passing over certain coordinates swore the sea beneath felt too deep, as if it were watching them. In post-war memoirs, some captains admitted avoiding certain waters not because of mines, but because something down there didn't like company.
In the years after the Second World War, the oceans became quieter to human ears, but far busier beneath the surface. Submarines slid silently through the deep, their steel hulls wrapped in secrecy, their missions recorded only in the guarded language of naval reports. It was during these decades that the Kraken legend found a strange new life, not in sailors' taverns, but in classified military files. Sonar operators, hunched in dimly lit rooms beneath the waves, would sometimes hear it first, an irregular, almost rhythmic thrum that seemed to travel far beyond the range of known whales.
The sound would grow, fade, and return in strange patterns. More than one Navy recorded these anomalies, marking them with vague labels: biological, unknown. Some reports never reached the public, but whispers leaked, as they always do. Stories of deep-sea shadows moving faster than any submarine, of sonar blips that would vanish abruptly, as though a vast living thing had dropped into a deeper layer of the ocean where no machine could follow. It was in 1968, somewhere in the North Atlantic, that a U.S. submarine crew reported contact with an object nearly the size of a battleship. It moved without propulsion, yet it matched their speed for more than 20 minutes before disappearing into a trench. The official explanation filed later described it as unusual cetacean activity. The crew called it something else: the Kraken. The Soviet Navy kept its own log of such encounters, sometimes far from any known legend's home waters, in the Barents Sea, the Black Sea, even beneath Arctic ice. The reports were classified, but among sailors there was an old joke. The Americans have their monsters, and we have ours. They just both live in the same ocean. Yet science was advancing, and for the first time, human eyes began to reach depths where only myth had traveled. Cameras dangled on steel cables returned images of the abyss: ghostly fish, pale crabs, shimmering clouds of plankton drifting in eternal darkness. But even then, in the unbroken black, there were movements the cameras could not catch. And so the Cold War did not only belong to men and machines, it belonged to something older, something watching the submarines as they slipped silently through the abyss.
By the early 21st century, technology had turned its gaze fully upon the deep. Satellites mapped the ocean floor, robotic drones prowled trenches once thought unreachable, and documentaries brought bioluminescent creatures into living rooms across the world. But with this new clarity came new mysteries, and for some, fresh proof that the Kraken was more than myth. In 2012, Japanese researchers captured the first full-length footage of a giant squid in its natural habitat. The creature's great eye reflected the submersible's lights like a coin from another world. Though the footage thrilled scientists, it only fueled speculation. If such giants existed unseen for centuries, could something even larger, even older, be waiting further down? Fishermen in the Bering Sea told of nets ripped apart not by sharks or whales, but by something that struck with sudden force, leaving behind tangled heaps of shredded rope and twisted steel hooks. In Norway, a trawler reported being pulled backwards against its engines for nearly 3 minutes before the strain suddenly vanished, the crew staring at the empty water where their catch had been. Oceanographers aboard research vessels occasionally recorded strange disturbances. On one expedition, near the Mariana Trench, instruments detected a rising column of water nearly the width of the vessel, ascending from the depths before dispersing into turbulence. No volcanic activity was detected. The lead scientist, in a private note, wrote only, "Large displacement event, possible biological origin." Even the public began to see hints of something vast. Amateur drone footage from coastal cliffs captured huge, shifting shadows beneath the waves, moving with deliberate, unhurried purpose. Marine biologists offered explanations: pods of whales, schools of tuna, tricks of light, but not everyone was convinced. The myth of the Kraken, it seemed, had adapted once again. It now lived not just in old sea charts and sailors' warnings, but in pixels, sonar returns, and cryptic data logs. Reminders that even in the age of satellites, the ocean still held secrets too large to name.
And so the Kraken story reaches the present, a thread of history and myth woven through centuries of human wonder and fear.
From Norse sagas to merchant journals, from whalers' yarns to sonar reports, its presence has been felt like a slow current beneath the surface, unseen yet always there. No one can say with certainty whether the Kraken exists as the ancients described, a monster with tentacles long enough to drag a ship under, an eye the size of a man's head, and a hunger for the world above. Perhaps it is only the giant squid, magnified by terror and distance. Perhaps it is a misreading of natural phenomena, rogue waves, deep-sea earthquakes, or the strange movements of water in uncharted trenches. And yet, the stories persist, because the ocean is not merely water and salt. It is memory. It is a vast library of all things forgotten, and some of its volumes have never been opened by human hands. Somewhere, in the great dark beyond the reach of sunlight, shapes drift that have never been named, and may never be. The Kraken may be one of them. Or perhaps it is the shadow of our own need to believe that the world still holds mysteries too large to measure. Far out at sea, where the night swallows the horizon, a ship might slow for a moment, the crew listening to the strange stillness in the air. The stars overhead glitter on the water's surface, and for a heartbeat, the black below feels alive. And in that moment, whether born of myth, memory, or truth, the ocean seems to breathe. Somewhere, in its deepest places, the Kraken waits.